Thanks very much. I think after Yusuf Muhammad's challenging talk, whatever I say might be an understatement, but I'll try. Okay, my lecture today, Who is the Pious Gentile? Moses Mendelssohn and Rabbi Jacob Emden on Reason and Revelation, the Moral Law, and the Universality of Salvation, will consist of an examination and analysis of correspondence between them about the passage from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah regarding the pious of the nations of the world. This lecture is part of a larger project of mine, examining the entire correspondence between them, including the letter about the Sabbathians. The correspondence actually consists of 4 series of exchanges. The first touching on Emden's anti-Sabbatic activities. We've heard a little bit about this before. The second, a purely halakhic exchange. The third, much discussed of late, the famous, extended, and quite sharp exchange on the issue of early burial. And the fourth and last, our topic today, on the passage from the Mishnah Torah. This entire correspondence between these 2 leading figures of 18th century German Jewry is of great significance and has attracted scholarly attention because it represents a critical transitional moment in the 18th century when tradition and modernity, old and new, layperson and rabbi, were in dialogue with one another. And no doubt vigorous, often heated dialogue, but dialogue nevertheless. One might be tempted to say that in this dialogue, Emden represents the pole of the old and traditional, while Mendelssohn represents the pole of modernity and the new. There's some truth to this, but stated in this unqualified way, it is simplistic and misses the mark. For as even a thumbnail sketch of these 2 major things indicates, presented, Rabbi Jacob Emden, the foremost rabbinic authority in Germany in the middle of the 18th century, a brilliant, volatile, many-sided, stormy, and independent figure, firmly rooted in the world of rabbinic Judaism, but acutely sensitive to the new currents that were coursing through it, perhaps even threatening to engulf German Jewry, German Jewish society of his day, and it was exceptionally wide-ranging literary creativity, often based on the use of grammar, philology, history, and the like. That creativity, communal activity was devoted to a renewal and transformation of that threatened, vulnerable Jewish society, on the one hand. On the other, Moses Mendelssohn, the leading Jewish layperson of his day in the eyes of his contemporary, both Jewish and Christian, who without abandoning his traditional loyalties and roots had carved out for himself a brilliant and meteoric career as a literary critic and a philosopher in the 18th century German Enlightenment culture, and thus became for his contemporaries, again both Jewish and Christian, both a model and enigma, a model of a Jew who could hold in delicate balance the elements of old and new, and enigma, for many found it difficult. Many still find it difficult to understand how to maintain it, if indeed he maintained that balance. So, as even this thumbnail sketch already indicates, in truth, both figures, and this constitutes certainly part of the fascination they hold for us, in both of them we find a blend of old and new, tradition and modernity. Though to be sure, in Rabbi Jacob Emden, the great rabbinic authority, the primary emphasis is on tradition and the old, while in Mendelssohn, the layperson, the enlightened philosopher, the primary emphasis is on modernity and the new. So let's examine the exchange between Mendelssohn and Emden regarding the passage from the Mishnah Torah of the pious of the nations of the world, and see what light it sheds on the relationship between these 2 towering, complex figures, and perhaps more broadly, on the relationship between the very categories of old and new, tradition and modernity. What are the commonalities between their views that emerge from this exchange, and what are the differences dividing them? Here, to anticipate my conclusion, let me say that when I first studied this exchange more than a quarter of a century ago, while recognizing the similarities in their views, I was more struck by the differences. Now, to the contrary, while still cognizant, very cognizant of differences dividing them, what unites them seems to me ultimately more significant. On October 26, 1773, Mendelssohn, once again evidently on good terms with Emden, despite their heated exchange regarding early burial that had taken place just a little over a year ago. So Mendelssohn consults Emden about a view of Maimonides set forth in the Mishnah Torah that he, Mendelssohn, found deeply troubling. The accepted view of rabbinic Judaism as codified by Maimonides was that the pious of the nations of the world have a share in the world to come. The definition of the pious nations of the world were those Gentiles who observe the Noahide laws. Maimonides, however, introduced a sharp limiting clause to this definition. As Maimonides states, you can follow it even in Hebrew and English. For purposes of time, I'll only read it in English. Whoever accepts the 7 Noahide commandments and is careful in performing them is included among the pious of the nations of the world as a share in the world to come. But this is so only if he, now we have the key proviso, limiting clause. This is so only if he accepts and performs them, because God commanded them in the Torah and informed us via Moses that the Noachites had been charged with them beforehand. So not just Noachites, it has to go through Moses. So for Maimonides, Mosaic prophecy is a source both of Jewish legislation and Noahide legislation. However, if he performs them because of the determination of his knowledge, of his understanding, Echra Adat, interesting phrase, he is neither a resident alien, a Ger Toshav, nor one of the pious of the nations of the world. And now, famous difference. Most standard texts, at least nowadays, most manuscripts, but one of their wise men. So he's not one of the pious, Ella. Another version, Villa, but not. So, at least in my view, the what's Aleph or above, the below is almost certainly a corrupt version. At least that's my view of many others. But it was this corrupt version of Maimonides' text, which was a version, by the way, cited by Spinoza, which I'm not going to go into, and available to Mendelssohn and to Emden. So Mendelssohn opens this letter, and you can sort of follow along in the letter again. I'm going to be reading part of it, paraphrasing it for purposes of time. That he already discussed this Maimonidean statement with Emden several times already. So Mendelssohn, quoting Rabbi Joseph Caro, who says the Kesef Mishnah, that's Rabbi Joseph Caro, said about this limiting clause that you have to accept the commandments only, because they've been revealed via God through Moses and through Noah. The Kesef Mishnah says that our master says this on the basis of his own reasoning, and this reasoning is correct. So, based on this, Mendelssohn notes there seems to be no Talmudic support for Maimonides' restricted proviso, and Caro states this. On the other hand, Caro says that there's no support, but it's right. So Mendelssohn, relieved that so eminent an authority as Caro admits that Maimonides' view has no Talmudic support, as we have Gottlieb pointed out. For Mendelssohn, the Bible and the Talmud are what represent the genuine Judaism possess authority. Post-Talmudic authorities do not possess the same type of authority. So you can disagree with Maimonides, you can disagree with Caro also, but still Mendelssohn's disturbed by Caro's agreement with Maimonides, saying this is a correct opinion, this is correct reasoning, and then in a very famous and impassioned statement, he proceeds to argue that Maimonides' view cannot possibly be correct. And you can follow along. Shall all the these words are harder than flint. Shall all the inhabitants of the earth from east to west, except for us, be cast in a pit of annihilation, be abhorring to all flesh, if they do not believe in the Torah, which was given to us as inheritance to the congregation of Jacob alone. Then I'm skipping to the next page. What then shall be done by the nations on which the light of the Torah is not shown at all, and which have not received the tradition except from untrustworthy the ancestors? Shall heaven forfend the Holy One, blessed be He, who ruled tyrannically over His creatures, destroying them and wiping out their names without their having done anything wrong? Is this called correct reasoning? Meaning referring to Caro. So Mendelssohn proceeds to suggest that Maimonides' statement derived from his philosophical view that good and evil belong not to the class of intelligibles. This is in Guide 1, 2, other places too. You can see the footnotes beneath his translation. But the class of things generally accepted is known. So for Maimonides, reason knows true and false, not good and evil. Since ethical laws then are not rational, this is Mendelsohn's argument, reason cannot be a ground for obliging one to observe the Noahide commandments which Mendelssohn understood to be equivalent to the universal moral law common to all men. So, again, Mendelssohn's reading Maimonides, the only ground of obligation for these commandments then must be divine revelation. Parenthetically, my task is not to explain Maimonides, but I think Mendelssohn confused intelligible, strict reason with Hechra Hadat, which means more reasonable, making sense. But that's a separate story. So in any event, let's leave what Maimonides actually believed out of the picture here. While Mendelssohn felt fairly confident the suggestion as to the philosophical roots of Maimonides' view was a correct one, he proceeded to denounce Maimonides' position that good and evil do not belong to the class of intelligibles as being very strange, and he notes that I have clear proofs that they do belong to the class of intelligibles, referring to certain philosophical works of theirs. Now, Mendelssohn has on page, sort of the third page here, 34, he mentions that Emden had said that he had discussed this in the Migdalos, his commentary part of the Siddur, and actually there Emden says that the moral law, good and evil, are intelligibles. So presumably Mendelssohn assumes that good and evil are, if Emden believes that, so then they can be based on reason. On the other hand, Emden at the same time has stated that Maimonides' restrictive proviso was supported by Talmudic text, which seems to indicate you have to believe in revelation. So what does Emden believe? That it's based on reason, is it based on revelation? So he's asking him to clarify it. Please clarify the matter. He concludes by cryptically alluding to a view of Nachmanides that seems to support the view that ethical laws are indeed rational, which actually he says in his commentary also on Noah. How could God destroy the generation of the flood? He had sent the prophets because everyone should know the basis of reason, that you don't steal, you don't engage in violence, you don't kill people. But here he seems to be referring to a different issue about, in terms of Noahide commandments. One of the 7 Noahide commandments is to establish courts of law. Maimonides understands this to mean the Noahides are commanded to establish courts of law to enforce the 6 other Noahide commandments. Nachmanides, in his commentary on the Torah, however, disagrees and argues that Noahides are commanded to set up courts of law in order to constitute a system of civil and criminal law. Again, there's a footnote in Micha's translation where he actually very kindly and correctly thanks me for making some observation on this point. So the way I understand Nachmanides is if there's a commandment to set up courts of law, meaning constitute an entire system of civil and criminal law, but from where are the Noahides to derive the content of that law? So it seemed that Mendelssohn felt, according to Nachmanides, this man's reason, which tells him what is just and unjust, and which would supply the outlines of this law. At least that's my take on it. Mendelssohn ends his letter by once again declaring himself to be the ever-loyal disciple of his master and teacher, and respectfully requests a reply. Mendelssohn's long reply of November 1773 is unfortunately fragmentary. Most of it's devoted to a long halakhic discussion of Talmudic principle commandments require intention. It does not, however, even touch upon the fundamental issue of the University of Salvation and only alludes to the question of the rationality of the oral law. As some scholars have concluded that Emden was not sensitive to the issues Mendelssohn raised. I think this is doubtful. Emden is generally very acutely sensitive to these questions. At the beginning of the response, Emden actually explicitly promises to discuss Maimonides' view regarding the rationality of the ethical law. He after discusses a number of other issues. And he asks Mendelssohn to be patient. Presumably, this discussion, which was missing because we have a fragment, was resuming the missing portion of his response. Oftentimes, Emden, his responsive, will engage in lengthy halakhic discussions of tangential matters, and only towards the end pick up the threads and tie them together. So it's particularly to be regretted then that the conclusion of Emden's reply is missing. So Emden begins, again, you could follow it in the English or Hebrew if you want. This is my rather rough translation. So he begins by quoting this, and actually he disagrees with Karo. Even though Karo says there is no source, I think there is a source. So what's and the source is actually from the very Gemara, actually, Shalmi Tosefta, from where we derive the whole basic principle. And I'm reading it. So Maimonides, in asserting whoever observes the 7 Noahide commandments is careful in performing them, is included has a share in the world to come, is following the view of Rabbi Joshua. How does Rabbi Joshua? It's an inference from the negative to the positive. Rabbi Joshua quotes the verse, "The wicked shall return to the netherworld, even all nations that forget God." He explains that verse to mean only those nations that forget God have no share in the world to come. Those who are aware of God who do not forget God have a share in the world to come. So the implication is that if you're not aware of God, you have a share in the world to come. So far, so good. I mean, I think that's fair enough. But now we have the key point here, and that is, what does it mean to be aware of God? To be aware of God means, or rather, what does it mean not to be aware of God? You're not aware of God if you're not aware of God who commanded them regarding the performance of the commandments. So to be aware of God means to be aware of the God of revelation. The God who commands. So if you perform the commandments on a basis of revelation, you're not aware of God. So he concludes thus the very passage for which Maimonides derived his ruling that it really indicates that you have to perform on the basis of there being divine commandments, because that's the only way you're aware of God. He makes the same point in the next paragraph also, about what does it mean to perform a commandment for the sake of God. To perform a commandment for the sake of God means because God revealed the commandments and decreed it. So again, if you're not aware of the God of revelation, then it means you're really not aware of God. Of course, this begs the question, really, certainly for Mendelssohn, this begs the question with a vengeance. And I'll come back to that. And I'll come back to it in a minute. I mean, in some sense, Mendelssohn would argue this is exactly the question which is at stake here. It's unfortunate he then says he'll discuss Maimonides regarding the rationality of the moral law later on, and we don't have it. Well, we have it actually in his Siddur. It should be noted, and I think this is an important point, that at most Mendelssohn has proved that observance of the Noahide laws be based on revelation. He has tacitly dropped the Maimonidean requirement that it be based on Mosaic revelation. I'll return to this point later on. How much time? How am I doing here?
6 minutes.
What?
6 minutes.
6 minutes?
That's according to the clock.
Okay. Okay. So okay. Okay. I want to make a few fundamental points. I'll try to sum it up. For Mendelssohn, the issue of universalism and particularism, reason and revelation were intimately intertwined. Of course, first of all, Mendelssohn believed that the fundamental principles of both the moral law and the fundamental truths of religion, God, providence, and the afterlife, about which we heard so much, are based on reason. These are the natural principles. And this is basically the unifying, what unites all men, all people together, both Jews and non-Jews. And the whole, Mendelssohn consistently emphasized that the glory of Judaism is that salvation is open to all people, because the Noahide laws are a natural moral law based on reason, and thereby it's open to all individuals. In light of this, we can understand why Mendelssohn found so troubling Maimonides' proviso, which restricted a very famous passage. Actually, twice he says, what about the people of the Indies? What are the people of the Indies who never heard about God's revelation to Noah? Greenlanders, on the basis of reason, they could find God. But if we limit it to reason, then people have access to salvation. If we limit it to revelation, then those people who lost the revelation, so they really lost it. What's actually striking is, again, unfortunately, I don't really have time to go into it, is for Emden, the moral law only has objective validity on the basis of revelation. Reason itself does not have the strength to give the moral law objective validity. Moreover, actually, in a very sharp comment, in the 8 chapters, chapter 6, Maimonides speaks about the view of the philosopher as the person who observes moral law out of virtue, because that's his natural desire, is greater than the continent person who desires to violate the law, but overcomes it. And Emden sarcastically remarks, yes, because the truth is that if you only follow the moral law on the basis of reason, if you will desire to violate the law, you'll never overcome those desires. It's not strong enough. Reason is not strong enough to curb illicit desires. So for Mendelssohn, revelation is necessary to give the moral law objective validity. However, and this is a point I want to emphasize. Let me get this one passage here, which I do want to quote here. Again, the Noahide laws, even for Emden, and like for Mendelssohn, even though for Emden they're based on revelation, while for Mendelssohn they're based on reason, for both they really have universal scope. Emden says God wished all mankind to attain felicity, and as the way to attain felicity to observe the moral law, God provided the Gentiles with universal revelation imposing the moral law upon them. And I want to quote here from Emden. It follows from divine justice that people will be directed along the smooth path of divine law. In such a manner they will be guided to true felicity, for it cannot be imagined a conventional or composite justice and good statutes. For this reason, the seven Noahide laws divinely revealed by God to mankind suffice, so that man should not be like beasts of prey without a ruler. So precisely because you need revelation to provide a grounding for moral law, God revealed the moral law on the basis of revelation to all mankind on the basis of divine justice. So it's actually rather striking. In this sense, they disagree as to what is the grounding of the seven Noachides, but all commandments. But they both agree that they both agree that they're of universal scope, and they were designed by God because of God's justice, in that all mankind should have access to universal salvation. As I said at the beginning, when I first studied this, I was more impressed by their difference in terms of reason and revelation. I was discussing this with Professor Jay Berkowitz last week, and he said Emden's view is really reflective of the rabbinic elite, the view of the rabbinic elite in the 17th and 18th century. We have an emerging, more positive attitude towards Gentiles in general, towards Christianity particularly, and they actually meant it. That's important. They actually meant it, not just for apologetic purposes. If we think about recent research, in the Middle Ages, Yuval and others, maybe he exaggerates about the fierce anti-Gentile sentiments in Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages. I think this universal shift is really of great significance, and perhaps more significant. I just want to than the difference between reason and revelation. Let me end with a story. A friend of mine, a woman was addressing a parliament meeting. They were raising money for Yeshiva Hesder. And she tells the story. She had gone to Beis Yaakov. We have some people like that here. She had gone to Beis Yaakov, and they were asked to raise money for Chinuch Hatzmai, good cause. So they came up with a great idea that this woman and a friend of hers, they would go to St. Patrick's Cathedral on Sunday morning. Everyone's going to church in a generous mood. They would stand there, other people, other schnorrers, there. They'd have their Chinuch Hatzmai box. Meanwhile, they get a lot of money until some attendant shoos them away. The next day, they go back to school and they have the most money and they're really proud of themselves. They tell the teacher their great idea, and their teacher is horrified. Teacher is, how could you give these goyim the opportunity to do a mitzvah and a commandment? I'm appalled. So after the talk, I went up to her and said, actually, I'm appalled at what the teacher said. In light of what I said that today, I believe that Mendelssohn, and perhaps more important, Rabbi Jacob Emden, would have been similarly appalled.
So we have 10 minutes, and I thought we take questions.